In 1931, Universal Pictures released Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi as Dracula himself. The movie was a massive success and also resulted in the world's most iconic image of Count Dracula. And let's face it, when you think of Count Dracula, this is the image you have in your mind. Also that year, Universal released another movie featuring a monster that would become just as iconic as Count Dracula, and that movie was Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Now, before we go on any further, I'm sure you're all aware that Frankenstein is actually the mad scientist who creates the monster and not the monster himself. But I'm sure you have all at some point referred to the monster as Frankenstein. I, myself, am guilty of this, especially as a child. But even now, as an adult, although I know the monster is not named Frankenstein, I still find it hard to not call him Frankenstein. So if I make a mistake somewhere in this episode, you'll have to please excuse me. The novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was released in 1818 by author Mary Shelley, who started writing the novel when she was 18 and she published it when she was 20. It was over 100 years later that our movie was released. That's not to say that there was not other versions of Frankenstein out there, but they were very few and far between, and they mostly had been live plays. Now, at this particular time in history, America was going through the Great Depression and Universal were having money problems. But the release of Dracula was a huge financial success, so of course Universal were quick to produce more horror movies. And the next movie would be Frankenstein, and the studio wanted Bela Lugosi, who played Dracula, to take the role of Frankenstein's monster. And although Lugosi did do some costume tests for this movie, which apparently made him look more like the Golem rather than Frankenstein, he ultimately decided that he didn't want the role, as his face would be covered by heavy makeup and he was a little bit vain in that respect, and he did not want to hide away his good looks. And so another actor was needed to fill the very large boots of Frankenstein's monster. The movie was originally planned to be directed by Robert Florey, who for some reason wanted a futuristic looking Frankenstein's monster, who was simply a killing machine, which was very far from the source material. It wasn't long before Robert Florey was shown the door and a new director took his place. That director was James Whale. It was James Whale who cast a relatively unknown actor named Boris Karloff, who caught the director's eye because of his impressive bone structure in his face, which apparently slightly offended Karloff, but not enough to turn down the role. And Whale was right. Boris Karloff had the perfect bone structure to build upon and make him into Frankenstein's monster. He was literally perfect for the role. But it was not just the look of the monster that Karloff had down. Karloff was a relatively unknown actor at this time, but he was simply an amazing actor, and he did a fantastic job at portraying the monster and bringing the truly tragic side of the creature to life. And considering the amount of makeup Karloff was under, that was no easy feat, but he made it work beautifully. In the movie, the mad scientist character is named Henry Frankenstein, instead of Victor Frankenstein as it was in the book. The movie opens with Henry, played by Colin Clive, and his hunchback companion Fritz, played by Dwight Fry, hanging around a graveyard in hopes of stealing away a corpse or two so that Henry can perform his experiment to breathe life into a creature he has pieced together using stolen body parts. But he also needs a brain, so he sends his hunchbacked assistant to acquire or steal a brain from his old teacher, Dr. Waldman, played by Edward Van Sloan. Fritz breaks into the school where Dr. Walden works, and upon finding the brain, he drops it. So he decides to bring back a brain labelled abnormal. Back in the lab, the brain has been inserted into the monster's skull, and preparations are underway when there is a knock at the door by three concerned friends of Henry Frankenstein. His old teacher, Dr. Walden, Henry's fiancée Elizabeth, played by Mae Clark, and their friend Victor, played by John Bowles. When it becomes clear that they are not going to leave, Henry invites him in to witness his experiment. Henry and Fritz send the operating table holding the creature up through an opening in the top of the tower, as Henry's scientific equipment in the lab spark and buzz around him, on a set piece that would inspire many more movies over the years, especially mad scientist movies, because this seemed to be the stereotypical set piece for a movie featuring a mad scientist even to this very day. In fact, that actual movie set was used over and over again in many other movies up until the 1970s. After finding out that the experiment was a success, Henry Frankenstein goes a little bit crazy as he claims that he now knows what it is like to be God. Let me play that scene for you right now.
Oh, in the name of God, now I know what it feels to be God.
Now, when Henry claims that he now knows what it's like to be God, that original line was cut out of the movie, or should I say, it was covered up by another sound effect for so many years until a full cut of the movie was found in the 1980s, I believed, and it was reintroduced into the movie. That line seemed too much for the audiences of 1931. Now, at this point in the movie, the creature is alive, but strangely, we don't actually see the creature right away. His reveal comes a little later, and his entrance is somewhat brilliant, as Karloff comes through the door backwards, and he slowly turns towards the camera. And then we get a jump cut and a zoomed in look at the creature's face, and it is very horrifying and somewhat sad. Karloff wanted to actually make his character look dead, and he had a few suggestions. First of all, Karloff decided that mortician's wax was needed to be applied to his eyelids, as Karloff believed that his own eyes made the creature look too much alive, and the application of the wax on Karloff's eyelids gave the creature a very different kind of look, with eyelids that were constantly half shut or half open. Karloff also had dentures to the side of his face, which he removed to cave in his cheek a little, making the character look a little more gaunt. And the makeup was indeed extensive, with a heavy brow and a flat head, with big bults on each side of his neck, and believe it or not, the monster was not portrayed as such in the actual novel. This was all created for the Universal movie. And even though Karloff was buried under all of the makeup, his performance did not suffer. There was still enough of the man left to shine through the makeup and show the many expressions of the creature's face. And Karloff played the creature as a victim, with a childlike nature and curiosity, and I believe that this is the reason the movie works so well, and is still to this day the ultimate version of Frankenstein. The creature is afraid all the way through this movie. I mean, yeah, he does get angry, but that anger is out of fear, and his motivations are driven by fear, and you really do feel a certain amount of sorrow for him, and that is all down to Karloff's performance. There is a scene in the movie where Henry Frankenstein opens a skylight to let the sun in, and we see the creature reaching up to try and touch the sunlight, and there's something very touching about this scene, as I believe the sun represents life maybe, and the creature is reaching out for it, and when Henry Frankenstein shuts the skylight and the sun vanishes, we see a sadness come over the creature as he reaches out for Henry Frankenstein instead, reaching out for something. I thought maybe some kind of comfort or just something. Maybe the monster does not even know what he wants, but he yearns for something. But instead, he is told to sit, which he does, like a loyal puppy. Still with his hands open wide, gesturing for some kind of help. It really is quite sad. There's also a scene where the hunchback character Fritz is tormenting the monster with a whip and then with fire, and you truly believe that the monster is afraid in this scene, and you feel for him, and Karloff does a spectacular job at portraying that fear through all that makeup. As Fritz continues to torment the monster, the scene cuts to Dr. Walden and Henry Frankenstein in the lab, and they hear Fritz let out a scream. And when they arrive where the monster has been restrained, they see that Fritz has been killed and is hanging from his neck. And with that, Dr. Walden and Henry Frankenstein decide that the monster must be sedated and killed. After this, Henry Frankenstein tries to resume his life with his fiancée, as Dr. Walden attempts to kill the sedated monster, who isn't as sedated as he originally thought, and kills the doctor and flees the lab. In the next scene, we see the monster meet a little girl named Maria by a lake, and she is not afraid of him, and she takes his hand. And this is probably the only time in the movie that we see the monster happy to have a friend, someone who treats him with kindness. The little girl shows him how to throw flowers into the lake and to watch them float. And when they run out of flowers, the monster innocently reaches out for the little girl and tosses her into the lake, expecting for her to float as well, just like the flowers did. But she sinks and drowns, and the monster looks distressed and confused and flees the area quickly. A little later in the movie, we see the girl's father walking through the village holding Maria's lifeless body, claiming that she had been murdered. This was a very dark scene for a movie shot in 1931, so as you can imagine, it didn't make it past the censors intact. But in my opinion, the cut that was made in 1931 actually made the girl's death seem worse. You see, in the original cut, it's clear to see that the monster did not understand that the girl would not float, and he was upset about it afterwards. But in 1931, the edit made to this scene actually looks worse, with the scene cut short just as the monster reaches out for the girl. And that's it. We don't actually see Frankenstein pick up the girl and throw her into the water. We don't see that Frankenstein is confused by the act and that he didn't actually mean to hurt the girl. We just see that Frankenstein reaches out to grab the girl and then the scene cuts. And then a little later, we see the father carrying a dead body claiming that she was murdered. And this suggests to the audience that was watching the film in 1931 that the monster killed her in cold blood. Ultimately, that cut made it more violent, strangely, and in my opinion, it would have been better to actually leave it intact. Now, here's a fun fact for you. Just like Maria in the movie wasn't afraid of the monster, the actress who played Maria, Marilyn Harris, was not afraid of Karloff in full makeup. And it is said that she would insist on riding with Karloff dressed as a monster on the way to set. And it was also said that she drove a very hard bargain. You see, during the lake scene, when Karloff threw her into the water, she didn't sink as intended. So James Whale, the director, had to bribe her to do the scene again, but this time sink under the water. She requested that she have 12 hard-boiled eggs. James Whale agreed, and she redid the take perfectly. And she received not 12 eggs, but 24 hard-boiled eggs. What a negotiator. Now, a little bit later, there's a scene where the monster enters the bedroom of Henry's fiancée, Elizabeth, played by Mae Clarke, and he attacks her, but off-screen, leaving a lot to the imagination. But apparently, Mae Clarke was a little nervous about this scene, as the image of Karloff as the monster actually scared her to death. But Karloff, being a gentleman, instructed Mae to look at his little finger during the scene, and when he wiggled it, she would know that it was himself, Boris Karloff, wiggling his finger, and not the monster. The monster once again flees the area, but this time he is hunted in the hills by a mob and Henry Frankenstein. The monster surprises Frankenstein and they have a fight with Henry coming off worse. And as the mob closes in, the monster grabs Henry and carries him up a hill towards a windmill. Now, Boris Karloff apparently suffered back problems in later life due to this scene, due to carrying Colin Clive up and down this hill. Apparently Karloff wanted to use a dummy, but James Whale, the director, insisted it be done his way. As Frankenstein's monster reaches the top of the windmill with Henry Frankenstein, the mob surround the bottom, and another struggle breaks out between Henry and the monster, which ends in Henry being tossed over the side and he hits one of the windmill arms on his way down. Now, before we go any further, I just want to say that this scene, considering the year it was shot as well, is fantastic. I think the way they did it is they built the bottom of the windmill, and then the top of the windmill must have been some kind of model. But they blended it perfectly. You can see where it's blended. Obviously, it was 1931. You can see where the model and the actual bottom of the windmill connect. They've kind of overlapped them both after filming. But it was done flawlessly, and it is a perfect scene and a really fitting ending for this movie. Now, the mob sets the windmill alight, and the monster eventually perishes in the flames. And he screams in terror as he dies. Well, we know that in the second movie he doesn't actually die, but in this movie it was played out that he died at the end of this film and he was burned to death. And it is a very, very sad ending, a tragic ending, a perfect ending. But of course, Universal was not happy. They believed that the movie needed a happy ending, not a bleak one, and crudely stitched on an extra scene at the end of the movie showing that Henry Frankenstein had survived the fall from the windmill. And he and Elizabeth lived happily ever after. This ending was just wrong in my opinion. The movie should have ended with Frankenstein dying and Frankenstein's monster dying together. And like I said before, the monster was not exactly a villain. He was a victim. The monster was afraid constantly all through this movie. And he was brought into this world, and then it was decided that he would be killed because he killed Fritz, who was trying to torment him. In a way, he killed Fritz in self-defense. He also killed Dr. Walden, but Dr. Walden was trying to kill him also. So, once again, you can excuse this. So far, the monster has acted in self-defense. He hasn't killed out of evil. But then we have the little girl, who he did kill, but not on purpose. He just didn't understand that she wouldn't float, and that she would drown. He didn't mean to kill her, he didn't want to kill her. And then, he was hunted by a mob, who then set the windmill alight and burned the creature to death as he screamed into the night. So you see, all through the movie, the creature was running scared. He was afraid, and he was confused, and he was hunted. And like I said before, I think the burning of the windmill was a perfect ending, and the happy ending that was pinned onto the end of this movie seems so out of place. as we see the survival of the man responsible for the monster's misery, moments after we listen to the monster's screams as he perished in the flames. Of course, like I said, after the success of this movie, it sparked a whole new line of Universal monster flicks. The Wolfman, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Mummy, and of course, more Frankenstein movies. Karloff played the monster 3 more times in The Bride of Frankenstein and The Son of Frankenstein, and then he hung up the boots and the balls. But Frankenstein movies didn't end there, as other actors took up the role, but none of the performances were ever as good as Karloff's. And to this day, in my opinion, he is and always will be the ultimate version of Frankenstein. Of Frankenstein's monster. Happy Halloween.